Hey everybody, and welcome back to our series on arguments. This is actually episode 6, the last episode of this second series on arguments, and it's all about fallacies. If you have been watching all the previous episodes of this series, then you've heard me say logical fallacies several times. And in fact, you've heard me refer to what's called the straw man fallacy. And that's because in our mentor text, Civil Rights Protests Have Never Been Popular by Ta-Nehisi Coates, his opening words are one common response. And he's basically setting up what other people have said about Colin Kaepernick doing his NFL protests, kneeling during the national anthem. A straw man fallacy is a completely fictional, made up, but easy to rebut argument that you attribute to your opponents. Ta-Nehisi Coates had actually written, one common response to Colin Kaepernick's protests is that Kaepernick should be hanged for treason. That would be a straw man. As far as I know, there's not really been anybody out there arguing that Colin Kaepernick should be hanged for treason. But if Ta-Nehisi Coates had said that, he would be teeing up a softball for himself, right? That this is nothing like treason, and anybody who says that is obviously wrong, and Colin Kaepernick wins. The problem is that when you set up a straw man, you are ignoring what your opponents actually have to say. And if you set up the straw man, it is a fallacy because it's a flaw in your thinking. Because you are human, I assume, this could be way in the future when the robot overlords have taken over. Hello, robot overlords, please subscribe. But because you are human, having a flaw in your thinking is actually really easy to do. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you go to the store and you buy a wiffle ball and a wiffle ball bat. You spend $1.10 and you know that the bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much did the ball cost? The answer and why you probably got it wrong right after the theme song. A logical fallacy is an error in reasoning. It's an error in your thinking. And it's something that seems perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical as you say it. It's only after you slow down and unpack it that you see where you went wrong, or when your opponent slows down and unpacks what you have to say. If there's a fallacy there, you better believe your opponents are going to let you know. That's probably why you said the wiffle ball cost 10 cents. In fact, if you slow down, you think about it, maybe write out an equation, the wiffle ball cost 5 cents. The bat cost $1 more than the ball, so 5 cents plus $1.05 is $1.10. Now, you probably said 10 cents right away without thinking, because that's an answer that came from your lizard brain. You have a lizard brain in your head. You also have kind of an amoeba brain, and you also have a person brain. But in particular, the lizard brain and the person brain are constantly fighting each other. The lizard brain is your quick thinking, fast acting, fight or flight kind of part of your brain. When human beings were evolving, it was important to have a quick thinking brain. You saw that rustle in the grass and you didn't want to slow down and think about whether it was your friend Og playing a trick on you out there on the savannah. You knew to start running because it was probably actually a lion that was going to eat you, if not your friend Og as well. So the human part of your brain is much more effective at puzzling out things like logic and making arguments. But because it is slow, it often loses to the lizard brain. Now, a lot of times, it doesn't matter. Your initial reaction to something and your thinking about it later reaction to something can be exactly the same. But when you are making an argument, it's really important to be sure that you're distinguishing between this is something my lizard brain thinks is a good idea, and this is something my rational human brain thinks is a good idea. Now, there are like 1,000,000,004 different logical fallacies that I could talk about. I'm actually only going to talk about 3 and 3 kind of related ones. So 6 plus straw man, that actually is. You know what? Fallacies. First fallacy I want to talk about is the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is a Latin phrase that means at the person. And what happens when you commit this fallacy is you ignore your opponent's argument and instead you attack your opponent. Now, sometimes it is warranted to bring up who a person is or a person's affiliation or the origin of a particular line of argument. But, you know, like, so here it is in 2018 and we still have Nazis. Crazy, right? But if you want to counter a Nazi's opinion, you need to do more than just say he's a Nazi. In Civil Rights Protests Never Been Popular, Ta-Nehisi Coates explains that his opponents are wrong, but he doesn't do it by attacking his opponents. One of the people that he's responding to, for example, is Joe Scarborough. He puts this Joe Scarborough tweet up where Scarborough is talking about Colin Kaepernick. Now, he could say, why are we listening to Joe Scarborough? He's a former Republican congressman from Florida. Of course, Republicans have nothing good to say about civil rights. Coates could have said that. Coates did not say that. Instead, he took on the substance of what Joe Scarborough and later David Leonhardt were talking about instead. And the kind of corollary fallacy that goes with ad hominem is the genetic fallacy. It's where you dismiss an argument out of hand because of where it came from. Like, you might not be willing to listen to any argument brought forward by your parents. That's a fallacy and also just kind of stupid, because if there's one thing that I've learned as an older person, your parents can actually be right sometimes. I'm sorry, I quit piano lessons, Mom. I'm sorry. The next fallacy is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, sometimes just called the post hoc fallacy for obvious reasons. Again, that's a Latin phrase. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore, because of this. Sometimes it's called faulty causality, where you say that because these two things happened in sequence or at approximately the same time, one must have caused the other, or they must somehow be related. For example, I could say that in 1984, the United States normalized relations with the Vatican, and then Michael Jackson's hair caught on fire. That is absolutely true. Both of those things happened in 1984, and they happened in that order. But when I say it that way, I think even the most lizard-brained among you can look at that and say, well, this is ridiculous. The US normalizing relations with the Vatican had nothing to do with Michael Jackson's hair catching on fire. Now, this fallacy happens a lot because it makes sense in the moment. We, as I've talked about before, we are a pattern-loving people. We love narrative. We love a story. We love a first this, then this happened. And so the post hoc fallacy is a kind of narrative. It's a kind of story. So we hear it or we think of it and we believe that it's brilliant because it fits our conceived notions about a narrative. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, in Civil Rights Protests Have Never Been Popular, he does not engage in this fallacy. But David Leonhardt, one of the people that Coates is arguing against, seems to. David Leonhardt looks at poll numbers today and sees that Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, very popular today. So he makes the case, or he tries to make the case, that therefore those protests, Dr. King and the civil rights movement, they must have been popular then in order to be popular today. That's clearly not true, and Coates has the data to explain why. A corollary fallacy for the post hoc is the cherry-picking fallacy, sometimes called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. I don't know where that came from. I do, but it's a long story. You don't want to know. But basically, the cherry-picking fallacy is when you look at a large set of data or a large set of evidence and you only pay attention to the pieces of evidence or the pieces of data that support what you already believe. For example, if Ta-Nehisi Coates had gone back to look at Gallup polls about King and the civil rights movement at the time, he found one poll that showed that Dr. King was unpopular, but all of the rest of the polls showed that King was popular. If he brought only that one poll, that would be cherry picking, because it is the piece of evidence that supports him when the rest of the evidence doesn't. And in fact, somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, he knows that he's going to put his thing up there on the internet, and the people who disagree with him are going to read it, and they're going to look for his cherry picking. So that's kind of the nature of the public discourse that Ta-Nehisi Coates is engaged in, and why you can kind of trust him not to misrepresent his data. And finally, I want to talk about the slippery slope fallacy. This is one where you say, if this thing happens, then a whole series of other things are going to happen, and eventually the world is destroyed in a nuclear war, or some other equally catastrophic thing. If we allow two men to get married, pretty soon people are going to be marrying their pillows and their goats. That's a slippery slope argument. And the corollary to that is false analogy, where you are comparing the thing that you're arguing about to something that doesn't really relate at all. Not every person you disagree with is Hitler. Really, there was only one person who is Hitler, and that was Hitler. David Leonhardt, to Ta-Nehisi Coates, David Leonhardt is not Hitler. Now, again, because you have this lizard brain, it is very easy for you, in the heat of an argument, even in the heat of frantically typing up your argument at 1 a.m. the morning before it's due because you are a teenager and you make bad life decisions, it is very easy to engage in a faulty analogy or to engage in a slippery slope. Ta-Nehisi Coates could have easily said, all right, fine, Colin Kaepernick should stop kneeling for the national anthem. And then what? Every single black man in the country is going to be gunned down by a police officer? Obviously, that is not the logical outcome. It's an exaggeration of what the logical outcome would be. So Coates doesn't make that argument. But you might. And that's why it's very important to slow down and think, does this consequence I'm talking about really follow? Is this analogy where I'm saying this particular thing is like thermonuclear war, or this particular person is like Hitler? Is that fallacy, or is that analogy really warranted, or is it a fallacy? Now, as I said, there are so many possible logical fallacies. When we really barely scratched the surface. We didn't even get to the fallacies that I think are the most fun. But these are the fallacies that I see coming up most often in student writing. Okay, the straw man. You really need to make sure that you're representing your opponent's arguments accurately. The post hoc or genetic fallacy. Attack the argument, not the arguer. The cherry picking and post hoc fallacies. Don't rush to conclusions or make assumptions that one thing will definitely happen if this other thing does. Don't ignore evidence that goes against your own position. And then finally, the slippery slope and the faulty analogy, right? Not everything you are arguing about is going to end in disaster. Not everybody you are arguing against is the world's greatest monster. Please, when you are making your arguments, slow down and let your human brain do the thinking, not your lizard brain. Okay? That's the end of the series. I'll see you for the next one. I feel ill.